Thank you so much. So I would like to invite all the speakers, or 4 speakers, to the table right now, and we will open the question session. I just want to clarify, this session, the first session today, is about the behavior, about the product. We will have a much longer session today on the health effects and toxicity and pharmacology. So I would like to encourage you to hold some of the questions about the toxicity and potential health effects of flavorings or different ingredients to the second session, when we will have more talks and more speakers talking about testing of the products and testing of the health effects. And I think we didn't, none of the speakers addressed the nicotine in the product and nicotine addiction, but my perception is that all our members, the members of committee, have been studying nicotine effects for many years, and this session was designed to inform us about our knowledge gaps and what we don't know and what we would like to learn from the speakers. So I would like to open the question session, and I think I will give the first. I would encourage the members of committee to maybe raise first questions.
So I'll just go through about 4 questions. I'll just go through them all. First is for Spike. You commented about the dry hits, which is something that I'm not very familiar with. Okay. Sorry, this is Dave Eaton. So a question for Spike regarding dry hits. It seems that is a circumstance where one could imagine generating some almost combustible products if you have a really hot end and there's not any liquid there, the residual could. Is that something that you indicated that's something like you only do once and then you never do again? Or is that a concern for repeated exposures?
It can happen accidentally, so it's not that it doesn't happen again, it's that you do everything possible to not let it happen again. The problem is, technologically, no one has really found a way to prevent it from happening at all. There's not a way to determine, the moisture level inside of the tanks or at the atomizer point to stop it from reaching that point. And yes, I'm sure there is some combustion when that happens, which is why people try to avoid it. Nobody wants fire in their throat.
A second question for either Danny or Spike, which has to do with, and maybe this is best for Danny, relating to the cost differential in terms of the differences in ethnicity and prevalence of and availability. What is the cost trade-off between somebody who wants to quit smoking and they're smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day and they're going to switch to ends?
Yeah, and Spike, feel free to chime in on this because you would know price points better. But regardless of product type used, we find that vaping products are more cost effective, whether it's a Cigaleg or a vaping device. Because once you make the initial purchase, whether it's a starter kit or the tank, after that point you're buying the e-liquids or cartridge refills, which over time is cheaper than a pack of cigarettes, especially in places like New York and New Jersey. So I believe that price does have a little bit to do with differences in uptake, but I don't think that it fully explains it. I think startup costs are higher, but I don't think that's the full explanation.
We opened our first store in a mostly African-American neighborhood in Queens, in New York, and we knew there were a lot of smokers there. That was the intent. There are a lot of smokers here. We can help these people. By having our cost of the initial purchase, the initial cost obviously is higher than the continued use of the product. But by having a product that had a very low initial cost when we first opened, it helped a little bit. The problem is that in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, which unfortunately is where a lot of Hispanic and African-American communities are, they can't afford the initial layout. So they're maybe not buying packs of cigarettes, they're buying loosies, they're buying occasional cigarettes, so it's more affordable that way. But you do have people now who are giving away e-cigarettes with the razor blade cartridge model where you have to purchase the cartridge from them, either free or very inexpensively. The problem is those are not the ones that work the best. So they're still at a disadvantage.
And I have 2 questions and then I'm done here. For Paul. The first is, in an ENS device and the heating process, does it get hot enough to, well, it won't combust to stimulate oxidation of flavorants? And what do we know about the potentially oxidized products and flavoring components?
There are probably people in the room better able to answer that question. Sorry. There are probably people in the room better able to answer that question than I. I will say that if those are produced, they're potent irritants. I mean, reactive species are potent agonists of the TRPA1 receptor that's responsible for various kinds of electrophilic nasties as well as various other kinds of flavor compounds.
Okay. And the second question has to do with, I was curious about the nicotine effects on cough suppression, and whether mucociliary clearance is obviously an important protective pathway, especially when it comes to air pollution, and whether one could envision circumstances where nicotine delivery devices and the nicotine may actually be aggravating impacts of PM 2.5 or air pollution, irritation in the respiratory system because of decreased mucociliary clearance from suppression of cough. Does that?
Could be. Although I have to say I'm getting a little out of my depth. I'm a psychologist. I do behavior, so I'm not a molecular biologist. I don't even play one on TV.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Kent Pinkerton from University of California, Davis. This first question is for Spike. I know we're not supposed to dwell on the health effects, but you mentioned that if we're going to really understand health effects, we have to create the proper conditions. So my question is, what is a dose response study that would be applicable to look at potential health effects of vaping? Do you have any feelings for that?
You mean how to design the study?
Yes.
Well, I've put together a couple with a number of people, some of them in the room. I think that the easiest way to tell whether or not it's enough for a user, for a consumer, you're talking about whether or not the person is absorbing enough to make it sufficient to avoid tobacco combustibles.
Right, or simply, what are the conditions that people are smoking under, and if we're going to be able to look at, if one is to look at health effects, what are those conditions that we should be trying to target to see what is the range of potential effects?
I mean, the problem is that, all of the studies are focusing on what are the potential health effects of e-cigarette use, but you have to factor in that almost all of the users are former smokers. And people are not really considering the factors of what health effects there are of quitting smoking, because there are negative health effects associated with that as well. So I think maybe you have to weigh out or weed out all of the things that may be a factor of being a former smoker first. Potential health effects of using the e-cigarette, I would say there are a lot of things that need to be considered, but at this point we're 14 years in. I've been using it more than 8 years, and I have at least 6 or 7 dozen people using it more than 7 years who would love to be in a study because they have no ill health effects. So until we start seeing ill health effects, maybe we don't know what areas we're supposed to be looking at, I guess.
Okay, right, thanks. And Jennifer, I was fascinated by literally the cigalites and the tanks. Is there something different about the delivery of the vapor based on what type of device you're using?
So I can tell you kind of anecdotally, I'm sure that somebody else Spike could probably give you a good example of kind of how it works with the devices themselves, but the cigalites are not designed, that's my understanding, to give off a lot of vapor. It really, they look like a cigarette. They're supposed to mimic cigarettes with the smoke that comes out of a cigarette, whereas the tank devices, you can switch up the ohms, the batteries, all sorts of things to produce a tremendous amount of vapor. So if you go online, there's competitive cloud chasing, which is literally trying to get the most vapor possible out of your device, and you can't do that with a cig-like. So anyone who wants to do tricks, blow rings, do tornadoes, would need to use a device that's made for getting more vapor out.
the the cigalikes, we made T-shirts. The first T-shirt we made for our shop said, "If it looks like a cigarette, you're doing it wrong," because they were not. We opened our first shop without any cigalike products, and for 6 years we've been successful without ever selling a cigalike, never, because the battery life is too short. The product doesn't produce a strong enough nicotine delivery. It doesn't deliver as well as the newer generation products. Our very first shop we opened had pen-style devices, but no cigalikes. For a lot of people, yes, it's visual. They want to see the vapor, they want to see the cloud, they want to see it looking like a cigarette as well. And we have a lot of times elderly people come in and they say, "No, I want something that looks like a cigarette." We say, "I thought you came here because you wanted to not smoke cigarettes." And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, then why do you want something that looks like a cigarette?" But even the form factor of holding it in your hand, you hold an e-cigarette cigalike like this, but you hold a pen style like this. The behavioral aspects are very different, and I think it makes a big difference as well. That and the vapor production makes a difference.
If I could add just one funny anecdote, I do a lot of work at the point of sale, assessing marketing and availability of products. And I went into one store and said, "Do you sell any e-cigarettes?" And she said, "Oh, don't use those, they don't work." The store owner said that, and she was referring to the cigalike products. So I think there is that perception that they don't deliver well enough.
I'll also add that there are very few flavors available with cigalikes, especially with the brand names that you can buy in, a store that's not a vape shop, for example. You usually only get tobacco flavor, menthol, maybe a fruit, one fruit.
All very helpful. And my final question is to Paul, and I apologize for this, but I teach veterinary students, and so I have to know, what do we know about the vomeral nasal organ, or Jacobson's organ in the nose? Does this have any factor in the use and behavioral use of nicotine or these delivery devices?
Yeah, as far as we know, there's no vomeronasal organ function, at least in adults. So that is probably not playing a role.
Okay, all right. I hear that all the time. I'm not sure I'm a believer of that, but okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I would say there is kind of pheromone-like function, although that's largely believed to be the main olfactory epithelium. But I mean, we could talk about it if you. Yeah.
Yes, hi. I am Anna Navas, a member of the committee. So I want to ask a question to Spike about if you could expand a little bit more about the metal materials and especially the coils. I think you didn't really mention too much about the coils. I am interested in what type of coils are the most frequently used, how people work with the coils, and if you have yourself, do you think there is something that can be done to, are they a reason for concern, the coils, and is there something that you think is being done to make them safer, or all what you know about the coils, if you could summarize it a little bit.
The commercially made coils are typically made of stainless steel or Kanthal metal, which seem to have less give off of metal particles. But people who are making their own are sometimes using other types. Recently, I guess in the last 2 years, they started making temperature control coils. They're not exactly temperature control because we're not putting a thermometer at the temperature of the coil, but they do monitor and keep the temperature from getting too hot, which prevents the dry hit and the burning sensation. These coils are made of titanium or nickel. And titanium and nickel coils, we don't really know the effect yet. We don't know if they get hot enough to give off metals, so somebody should probably study that. However, the temperature control market did not take off, and over the last year and a half, it went up and it went down, and nobody really was interested in it. Partially because it caps where the heat can go, and people don't like that. They want it to get hotter. Stainless steel seems to get hottest fastest and seems to be taking over the market as the most common material for coils. It has the cleanest taste and flavor. Maybe that's because it gives off less metal particles. Maybe it's not, but we need studies to find that out.
Thank you. This is very useful. What about the ceramic coils?
I'm not the right person to ask. We have never sold ceramic coils in our shop. We prefer not to sell ceramic coils. I don't know. There's not enough data on it. But since the ceramic coils are made in China, we don't know for sure that they are heated to the right temperature to get rid of all of the toxins that need to be gone before you can heat it and inhale it. And that's always concerned me, so I've never sold ceramic coils. There are a lot of shops selling them. If they're made properly and the ceramic is heat treated properly, then they're probably fine. I don't think that they're porous enough to prevent dry hits, but because the ceramic is not a cloth wicking material, the chances of combustion are very small. So there's good potential there if the ceramic is treated properly. I just don't trust, because I don't know who's making it.
Thank you. And I want to ask Jennifer, if in the qualitative research that you've done, have people talk about the coils? Is that something that they like to play with them? Is that important in terms of safety of concerns, or
Definitely,
is that concept?
definitely. So when we talk to young adults who happen to be kind of the hobbyists that I talked about, coils are one of the things that they change. And actually, there have been some older youth who I've spoken to as well who change out the coils. And much like Spike mentioned, I don't know that they're actually always ordering it pre-made. I think in some cases they're going to Home Depot. I don't even know where you would get those, off Amazon, and making them themselves. That's part of the hobby of it, is seeing how much you can break down these devices and build them up yourselves. So.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sharon McGrath with Johns Hopkins. I just had one question, I guess to Daniel and Jennifer. From the data that you were discussing, it sounds like many of the young people, and even the young adults, adolescents and young adults who are actually using e-cigarettes, daily or more often, are ones that are trying to come off cigarettes or tobacco. Is that right? And if so, if you remove flavorings from the e-cigarettes, do you think that would affect the ability to use the e-cigarette as a cessation device?
So actually, among youth, youth are not typically using tobacco products. They're not typically using end products to get off of tobacco products. There's a correlation, but the reasons for use are not for cessation among youth. Now the question about flavoring, if you remove flavor, would it appeal less to youth? Yes, I think it would, but as Spike mentioned before, what a lot of people who have quit smoking using ENDS products say is that they like the flavored aspect because it's not tobacco. It doesn't remind them of smoking. So it's a tricky place to be in, because you do want to minimize appeal to youth, but at the same time, you also want people to quit smoking.
And I agree. For the youth, it's not primarily to quit smoking. Sometimes we do talk to older youth or young adults who are using it to quit smoking. But as far as we have asked, if flavors were not available, would you continue to use it? And for some of the youth, it's the appeal of the vapor. It's the appeal of the cloud chasing. So they also like the flavors, but in some cases, they say they would continue to use it.
So Adam Leventhal, thank you to the panel for some great information. So for Spike, you had mentioned safety features that can be built in. Can you describe what some of those would be?
A lot of the devices that are being used have ports in them to update software. It sounds crazy technology, but you can plug them in and update the software in the chip that's inside of the device. The problem is that it also sometimes functions to charge the battery, and they're not intended to charge the battery. So some of the devices that are not, they do not have overcharge protection. They charge the battery past the capacity that the battery can hold. And when it charges too far, that's when the battery explodes. Now, there are devices that are made with overcharge protection and circuit protection in them, but not all of them are, or sometimes the circuitry fails, and that's a problem. Also, most of them are made not to use fast chargers like we use for our cell phones. Our cell phones have 2 amp charging, and they can charge very quickly. And while there are some e-cigarette devices that can take 2 amp chargers safely, because they have LiPo batteries or different types of batteries, some of the lithium-ion batteries cannot handle fast charging like that. However, the port on them is a micro USB, which is the same as an Android cell phone. So people just take their Android cell phone and plug it in, even though they're not supposed to use 2 amp chargers, and it overcharges the battery and can be damaging. But you have someone else in the room that will have much more information on that in much more detail.
Thank you. Jennifer, you mentioned on one of your slides general standards for qualitative research. So as the committee goes through a number of qualitative studies, I was wondering if you could suggest an article that would be the gold standard that would say these are the types of procedures that would make a qualitative study rigorous.
Oh, so one that examines the methodology, you're saying, not on e-cigarettes, but just in general?
Yeah, not on e-cigarettes, but like best practices, because a lot of us are more familiar for quantitative research and research design, but for qualitative research.
Sure, I'd be happy to put together a couple. I don't know if I could come up with one, but I'd be happy to give that to the committee.
Thanks so much. I just have a couple more. I'll go through briefly. Daniel, thank you for the talk. You reported some data on never smokers, right? And so I think I just want to clarify the definition, because I think you did some analyses that were not publicly available or haven't been published yet for some of the data. Were you talking about never smokers as in like never tried a puff of a cigarette or a combustible, or the more kind of liberal definition that's been used, like 100 cigarettes in your life?
So all of the analyses that I presented were people who have never taken a single puff of a cigarette. And for youth, I was looking at tobacco use, and those are youth who have never touched a single tobacco product, not people who have tried it but have never been regular users. These are people who have no experience using tobacco.
Okay. Thanks. And for Paul, it seems like that the flavorants that are added to mimic some of the sweet or fruity flavors are well known. What about the flavorants that are added to mimic the flavor of tobacco? Is there much known about those types of flavorants and their psychophysical effects?
Yeah, don't think those, at least I personally haven't studied those nearly as much. I mean, I'm afraid I can't give you a good profile of what a tobacco flavor is.
This is Richard Miek from the University of Michigan. Just have one question for Jennifer. It's about youth use of vaping. And when I think of a regular smoker, I think of somebody who's smoking a cigarette every couple hours because of strong cravings. And are there regular youth vapers who are just, or at least they think they're just doing flavoring, but do they have to vape every couple hours? Or are there some youth who are just vaping for big conferences or big places where they're going to show off how big a cloud they can make? If you could provide some information on that.
Sure. So I think it probably depends, and it probably spans a range. For the research that we have with regular users, youth, that's in review, we actually recruited youth who reported what we considered regular use, which was every day or some days. And we kind of keep it a little squishy, but what we were looking for were youth who do it more than maybe one time on the weekends. Beyond that, and I think this is a larger issue, it's really hard for users to quantify how often or how much they use, and those are two separate issues. So I think it probably runs the gamut. In my research, I wanted to actively recruit kids who were using more than maybe once on the weekend at a con that they went to, or when their friends all came over. I was looking for kids who were doing it, if not all throughout the day, though we did hear about kids using at school. Were using it after school with their friends, that kind of thing. Is that helpful?
Yeah, so is it possible there could be someone who's using, a youth who's using regularly? They're not addicted to nicotine. But
it could be if they own their own device, if they are buying their own e-liquid, and they're buying e-liquid that they're sure or that actually has no nicotine in it. The problem is that a lot of youth, especially the younger youth, aren't able to buy their own devices. They're taking it from an older brother or sister or from a parent. They get what they get and what they're able to get. Sometimes it's with friends and they share it. So they don't really get a say. They don't want to use nicotine necessarily, and some of them are able to describe sort of the feelings that they get, the throat hit, and with nicotine. But in a lot of cases, they're not able to really choose whether they use nicotine.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is Tony Alberg from the Medical University of South Carolina, and I appreciate the issue of the racial, ethnic differences in the prevalence of use being raised. I think it's interesting because it appears to closely mimic what has historically been seen with nicotine replacement therapies, where African Americans have low prevalence of use due to replacing one harmful product, combustible tobacco, with another which was perceived to be high risk as well. So I just wanted to drill down on that a little more, because the same is also true for Hispanics, and I didn't hear that group mentioned, or I missed it if it was mentioned. And I'm also curious if there's been any qualitative research published or in the works to drill down on this issue.
So the reason why I didn't talk about Hispanics or Latinos a lot today is because I think if ends do have real harm reduction potential, they would benefit groups that are using combustible tobacco at the highest rates. And in the United States, that's white Americans and black Americans. Actually, the rate of smoking among black Americans is actually higher because prevalence of cigarillo use or little cigars is high among that group. Also, if you look at rates of ends use, it's typically lower among Hispanic and Latinos nationally. So I think that's, I was really thinking about it more in terms of who could potentially benefit the most given their higher rates of combustible tobacco use.
And qualitative research, I don't know, Jennifer, if you're aware of any work that's been done, or if any of your work has looked at different racial ethnic focus groups, for example?
Not mine personally, no.
So just to clarify, Hispanic use of ends is low?
Except among youth, experimentation tends to be high among that group. But when you really hone in on the frequent established users, yes, it tends to be lower among Hispanics.
I know it's not, qualifiable data, but we have 10,000 people in our computer, and there are 185 people with the last name Rodriguez. So we have 18 Flores. There are a lot of Hispanic users in New York City. And you said you go to Columbia? Mm-hmm. It might be something worth looking at different shops and asking the consumers that come in about their race and ethnicity and asking them details that way.
Yeah. These are, so everything I presented was national data. So a limitation of that is that everything is in aggregate. So there are certainly geographies where patterns of use are different.
Gideon Helen, UCSF. Two questions to Paul. The first one is, and both of these are related to flavors. What is the range of the percentage of flavorants by volume in e-liquids?
I have seen one that say it could be as high as 1% by weight.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then how do you think the percentage of flavorants would affect the physical chemical characteristics of the e-liquid, and how the e-liquid is aerosolized by the e-cigarette?
I've done this a lot. That kind of biophysics is not my area of expertise, but I would guess, probably not a great deal. I will defer this one to Pam Dalton if you talk to her tomorrow. She's done more work on aerosols.
Okay, good. Thanks.
And I would like to ask one question, if I can. I would like actually Spike and all speakers address this question, this problem, switching between the flavorings. So the users tends to, when we talk about the smokers, they have their own brand, they prefer tobacco or menthol, and they smoke a specific brand of the products. it looks to me that for e-cigarette users, vapers, they like to switch for some reasons. They stop feeling the flavors, so they try a different one. Can you comment on it? Because I think it will be very relevant to our assessment of the health effects of the flavorings. You know, how can we assess one flavoring when the user switch to another one, and why it is like that?
They have something called vapor's tongue. I'm sure you've heard of it before. You've talked to a lot of vapers now. When you use the same flavor for a length of time, you become numb to the flavor. It's like when you work in a movie theater, you don't like buttered popcorn anymore. I can't taste the buttered popcorn. I smell buttered popcorn 8 hours a day for how many days a week? So you become numb to the flavor, and they switch flavors. Oftentimes, if they have a flavor they use regularly for a number of years, they'll switch flavors and then switch back to that flavor once they've kind of undone that. But
I was just going to say that this is, I would assume, mostly for tank devices. So cig-a-likes, because there are fewer flavors, people tend to pick one and stick with it. So when we're talking about this, it would be with the tank-style devices.
Yeah, well, just one comment. When I saw the term vapor's tongue, I thought it's most likely vapor's nose. But you know, there is both short-term and long-term adaptation to odorants. I guess that would be what's going on there.
This is Nancy Morgati. I have a couple of questions. One is the national survey data that you've presented to us, and even the qualitative data are sort of like snapshots of one time. But my sense is there must be, and some of the other questioners asked these, there must be some sense of how things change over time from the time you start to the time you settle into something else. And I was especially wondering, because of saying that the adults are mostly using cig-a-likes, but those are not very effective, and that's the population where we may be most interested in harm reduction. So is there much research or even experience or commentary that any of you could tell us about what's the pattern like if you follow people over time?
And Spike can probably provide a lot of anecdotal evidence of people's trajectories and pathways, but I'm going to make a plug again for the PATH dataset, the Population Assessment of Tobacco and Health. It's a joint effort by FDA and NIH, and it's longitudinal. It includes both youth, young adults, and adults. It has close to 50,000 participants, so it's a really rich dataset, asks detailed questions about device types, patterns of use. So I don't think that there have been any published longitudinal analyses yet, but they are forthcoming, and they'll really be able to describe in detail people's trajectories.
Okay, great. Spike, I'd love to know what you think and what you have observed.
I would very much disagree with that most adults are using cig-a-likes. I would say most adults who have tried e-cigarettes tried cig-a-likes because the cost is lower. Initial purchase is $8 to $10. However, the people that continue to use e-cigarettes or vapor products in general are not using cig-a-likes because they don't seem to work as well. But the progression is most people who stay with vapor products progress to a better product from a cig-a-like.
And then I wondered, two more questions. One is just, do we have any information about the use of these products in Native Americans? Because that's the group that smokes at the very highest rates in the United States.
Yeah, so I tried to run some analyses with the Native American population because they are the group with the highest smoking rates. I was thinking about the largest major groups. Whenever I tried to do really detailed analyses, the sample size got really small, so my confidence intervals were super, super wide, and I couldn't really make any statements confidently. But we do know that combustible use is greatest among that population. And also, rates of ends use is pretty high among that population as well. But again, to present a specific estimate, I felt uncomfortable doing that given the really small sample size.
And then I guess my final question is simply, you guys are at the cutting edge of these kinds of questions and this information. We can find what's written and published, but I'm wondering if there are things that you're aware of that are sort of new trends in how people are using these products, or I guess mostly in how people are using the products or the products themselves that we should be aware of, or any new information that might be coming out in the next, that we might miss because it's so new. You guys would know.
My only main comment is that because youth use of vapor products that make big clouds was more of a trend. It does seem to be dying off, and it seems that youth are tending towards, I don't want to say a specific name of any product, but smaller cig-alike style products with higher nicotine, when they were using products that didn't have nicotine, or they assumed didn't have nicotine, to blow clouds. Maybe not youth, but young adults, I would say, more so. But again, our stores are 21 and over, so it's hard for me to assess youth use very well.
And I just say, with some unpublished data from youth and research in the past year, that they are very clear that it's fallen out of favor. The older youth, so the 16, 17-year-olds, feel like it's not as popular as it was when they were in middle school, maybe. And this is, obviously a little anecdotal. There's no sense of what the next big thing is, but certainly in looking for memes, which is always a really good way to see kind of what the latest thing is among teens. Online, there are as many memes pro-vaping as there are anti-making fun of kind of the vape culture. So, for whatever that's worth.
And I need to take an opportunity to stop the discussion right now. You see, the members committee, the members of the committee are very curious about all this and ask a lot of questions. We are aware that we have two questions, one from audience and one from online, but we will collect the question and maybe forward the answers and answer it later. So we would like to take a break right now for 15 minutes, and we will start again at 11. Thank you so much.
Panel.
Thank you very much.